I think Simryn's a highly worthy representative from Australia at this coming Venice Biennale. I think it's a very exciting choice, so congratulations to the Australia Council for making that happen. For me, Simryn, as an artist, she's curious, she's subtle, poetic, and most importantly, very inclusive in her creative work. She's also refreshingly straightforward, which I think you will soon see, which is a good thing. So I'm just going to ask a few questions. My goal is to have Simryn talk rather than me. There are a few sort of general questions to start with, and then I might continue with some questions, but also ask if any of you have some questions or interjections that you'd like to make in the discussion. But first of all, I'd just like to ask you, Simryn, you've spoken in our previous conversations about how important it is to occupy the space that you have been given. And you talk about the process of habitation. Just wondering if you'd like to elaborate on that a little bit.
Okay. I'll move forward a bit. Thank you, Michael. Michael has said that I'm a little bit straightforward, and to kind of calm myself down and ease myself into doing something which artists we don't often do. I'm going to say that it's when you sign up for, when Simon called me and said on the phone, would I do Venice, there were many things that crossed my mind and many things that I had to think about. Will I, won't I? It wasn't an instant choice, but one of the things you don't think you're signing up for is public disclosure. It's not a comfortable position, and so having said that, I guess I'm making a little bit of an excuse and slight discomfort in this role. It's an interesting question you ask about how we occupy. I guess occupy is a slightly loaded word now. It's in the last few years in an interesting way. Habitation is another word, and I've said, how do I do this? In many ways, that my becoming an artist was a way of working out my living in, coming to live in Australia, which was an outcome of a personal, I got married, and my husband has Australian papers, where the part of the world I come from, it wasn't an option that he get papers for my. It's complicated. These things are complicated, and so in the mid-80s, as a young mother, I came to Adelaide, and I started the process of leaving one life and trying to figure out how to be in a new place, and that unfolded through a semester at an art school in Adelaide, which is sort of the extent of my formal art education, if you like, hanging out with the people that he would have hung out with, conversations, a town which was, and I imagine still is, extremely sharp, critical, creative, focused, and intelligent, but also very far from anywhere else. And in that sense, Adelaide was, in the 80s, a really interesting place to figure out. So I think of, and for me, the making of art has always been a process of figuring out rather than the product that comes at the end of it. And I guess that's the same principle that I've brought to bear in occupying, in both with a capital O and a lowercase o, the pavilion in Venice.
In this process of figuring things out, you as an artist have not focused on one single medium. You've also described your practice as something akin to an investigation, where you're happy to use really any means at hand that come to hand. How do you balance the different media that you work with on a day-to-day basis?
I'll go back to answering that through the first question, which is about a kind of habitation and occupation. So there's questions, and I work through questions, and I express questions in formal, material, or even action-based kind of outcomes. But because I often decide that I want to do things in a certain way. It's neither possible nor desirable for me to go out and learn every way of doing things from the beginning. So the result is that I have found many relationships and ways to work with many different makers, thinkers, fellow artists in arriving at the things that I arrive at. And some of these relationships have continued over 15 or 18 years, and they're in different places. I carry them with me. I go back to people I've worked with in the past, and they accrue, and I learn things, and work comes deeply out of conversations and what's possible in a place. So when we went back to live in Singapore for a while, I was working with things that were possible there. Moving to Sydney in '96 required, it shifted things. There was no longer the space for a studio, and I started working photographically, and I met a very wonderful printer, Sandra Barnard, who works out in Lane Cove. She was in North Sydney at the time, and my relationship and through conversations with Sandy have led to the work going off in other directions. And also for it to be possible, often I'd ring Sandy and go, well, do you think we could do something like this? And she'd go, well, I've never tried it. Why don't you make a start and we'll see where it takes us. So it's never alone.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned your studio. As a bit of an aside, do you have a studio here? What does it look like? What do you do when you arrive in the studio in the morning?
My studio has forever been the kitchen table.
Yeah, thought it might be.
So which means that you clear up breakfast and then occupy. Occupy is a great word. It's going to be my theme word for today. So you kind of occupy the table until about 6:30 when there's a bit of restless energy around the house, and then you have to kind of remove yourself. But for the process, for getting the works done for Venice, I did take on a studio in Marrickville, which was a revelation, and I loved that process of going in, having the quiet ritual, starting work, doing a full day's work. And I think that, again, as every new activity leads to the next thing, I fear that having worked on a whole new scale for Venice, I might have got myself hooked into the next cycle of how I need to do things, which might be moving away from the kitchen table. I don't know.
Good luck. To zero in a little bit now on some of your work, and in the title of the work for Venice too. I mean, trees and other plants feature very prominently. Mm-hmm. Would you like to talk a little bit about how they might work, sort of metaphorically, around some of the themes you're interested in, such as place, mm-hmm. or even displacement?
Mm-hmm. I think you don't. This is how I would describe it. I didn't actually understand how deeply informed I was from my part of the world in my looking and in my sense of ease until I left it. And my first encounter of Adelaide was nothing was green, even though I was told that it was green, but I'm afraid if you come from the equator, it's very different. And then through that letting go of one place and trying to understand how to enter another, and again, without articulating it on any overly theorized level, it seemed instinctive to me to turn to look at nature. I started gardening in Adelaide as a way to make something more familiar for myself. And at that point when I was doing that, I realized that both my mother and my grandmother, who similarly had moved on marriage, both to what was then Malaya, had done the same things, and they brought with them, which they could in that part of the world, seeds and seedlings. There were mango trees. I grew up with things that you normally wouldn't find in the Malaysian landscape. So Bombay mangoes, my mother's from Bombay, and jamun trees from the north of India, things that really struggled to make sense of that climate because the equator is not seasonal. And similarly, I found myself doing those things in Adelaide. And my first works, because I had young children at the time and really lived through the cycle of very young children, which is a way of controlling time that I really miss now, because a lot of time and freedom and choice is actually the opposite. My first works came out of that process of gardening.
You talk about gardening. I mean, from my experience, having tried to build a garden in Canberra in the clay there, a lot of the time you spend weeding.
Yeah. Yeah.
That sort of comes into your work a bit too, doesn't it? This notion of what is a weed?
Oh,
Can trees be weeds?
What do you pull out? How do you make a choice about what you pull out?
Yeah.
And it leads to some really interesting domestic arguments, but very quickly, and you can be cute about it, but there's a very interesting political, I have to say, when I first arrived in Adelaide, I came across this notion of native gardens for the first time. There was this sense of what is allowed and what isn't allowed, and I hadn't, from my part of the world, encountered that sensibility. And there were certain introduced species of animals which I realized were extremely undesirable, and something in your mind quickly goes, okay, we'll keep this to the flora and fauna world, but shouldn't take it too much further than that. It starts to enter dangerous territory. So there's a very curious sort of set of boundaries within that. And then if you come back into my part of the world, where I've realized now in Malaysia, native gardens are becoming really interesting. And I did ask someone, so when did they decide time started if you're making a native garden? After all, it's part of the old world where things have moved forever. Yeah. And at some point you have to draw a line and say, okay, everything that came after this is bad, and everything that came before that is good. It's a very powerful territory.
And has great potential for metaphor also, of course.
Yeah.
Now, as well as the landscape and trees and plants and gardens, you clearly love the written word. Mm-hmm. You work closely with books, some of which come off sort of worse for wear in some of your pieces of your works of art. Could you say a few words about your relationship with the book and the idea of the book?
Okay. I'm a reader. I also write, and I thought actually that I would be a writer, and somehow maybe I didn't have the discipline, but I write. I think of myself as writing with material and writing with stuff. But I'm also fascinated by the kinds of rigid force of the written word, and the kinds of versions of right and wrong that become overlaid through things that actually are written, as opposed to the ephemeral, the material, and the spoken. And so I have got this strange in and out relationship with the printed word. And at the moment I'm reading a book which I highly recommend, which is Ross Gibson's recent book published last year on the Dawes notebooks of he's writing down in translation of the Eora language with the First Fleet, and really talking about those, what is fluid and what is contingent and contextual, and how when that becomes fixed into symbols and signs, the content and meaning becomes shifted. And I'm not taking sides, but I'm fascinated by the flow between those two things.
Now also, Simryn, in your work there's a lot of sort of references to cycle or representations of cycles of time, tides, seasons, renewal, decay, changes in materials over the passage of time. You also use ephemeral materials in some quite challenging climates. So thinking of sort of fragments of printed text installed in trees in tropical gardens. Just wondering how you feel also then about the permanence or the life cycle, lifespan of your works of art.
It's a really interesting question for an artist, and particularly talking to you as a museum person. And it's a little bit like the relationship between the spoken and the written. And I have to say I lean in the direction of the spoken. Similarly, as I have a real unease for the way in which things that get recorded then can go on permanently on the internet, so nothing can become a memory or a rumor or something that was misheard because everything can be checked. And it's the mishearing and misremembering and the way things get described and passed on through description that we lose out on, because everything has, again, it comes back to real versions as they really are and they really were meant to be. I think I don't have such a strong relationship with that way of being in the world.
Simryn, just to wrap up before we perhaps open up the floor a bit for questions, with your work for the exhibition at the Venice Biennale coming up, so how and when did you start focusing on that project? Well over a year ago, right?
I went to visit the pavilion in November 2011. So I think I was invited very early, which was a very nice thing. It was in October, I believe, and I was already engaged in something that was keeping me very occupied. Actually, a piece of writing, which I sort of then fixed in printed words. So I'm kind of undoing exactly what I'm saying as well, but which artists are allowed to do, I think. And so I wasn't free really to start work until last June. There's things that we keep in our heads and ideas that float around. Wouldn't have been possible to just jump in and start from scratch. But what a project like Venice allows is for me, what it allowed was an incredible possibility to work with those kinds of makers and collaborators in a way that otherwise simply would not have been doable because of scale, because of costs, so there were these, certainly two of my main projects had been floating in the back of my mind for a while, and this was the moment in which to do it. And in many ways, it happens in Venice, we'll go to Venice, but what the project has done for me is to allow me to activate just about all my standing creative relationships in this city. And in many ways, it is a show, for me, it's a show about my relationship to Sydney as well. So,
that's a fantastic point to stop my questions. And I wonder if anyone else has some follow-up questions I'd like to ask. Yeah, over here.
I understand that Catherine Desagues felt a great affinity with you as an artist, and I just wondered if you could perhaps just give a bit of an insight into what the relationship between you and Catherine as curator was like for the Biennale.
In a general sense, as I said, with working with makers and people who you talk to and figure things out with, Catherine, I work very well with in the curatorial relationship. I think it's different for different artists because I really like the argument, and it can even be its affinity. It can be a degree of difficulty. We keep we challenge each other on various ways. And I think Catherine and I bring very different approaches to what we do, but we both have a great affinity to the idea of collaborative ways of working. And so I like to think that we kind of drew out more from each other than either of us would have done standing alone. It's I don't know how else to describe it without kind of going into too much detail, but it was, and again, it's something that was made possible because of the brief that the Australia Council provides the artists, where when Simon did call me, he said, well, you can pick who you work with, and I took him for his word and did precisely that.
Any other questions?